Morning, everybody. This is Farida Lavangee. So today we're covering some topics such as financial reporting and the importance from a donor perspective. One of the things I'd like to touch on is why is financial reporting or the transparency of financial reporting so important to an organization? I think the biggest thing from a financial reporting perspective and transparency is that one of the greatest benefits that a nonprofit can get from this is it leads to donor confidence. So if your accounting records or your financial records are prepared adequately, so obviously it's accounting for all of the transactions, it clearly shows what the organization does, how the money is being spent. That will only lead to donor confidence, which ultimately will then lead to donors wanting to support your organization in the future, which then obviously leads to the sustainability of the organization itself. I wanted to touch on a preparation of audits from an organization perspective and how can an organization ensure that they are adequately prepared. I think before we go into how should you prepare, the first question would be is what are the different types of audits that you get? And the two main types for a nonprofit is one would be a donor audit, and the other one would be the statutory audit, which is the audit of the organization. Essentially, the key difference between these two is that an organizational audit is an audit of the entire organization. So we're looking at all income, all expenditure, whereas a donor audit is specific to a donor itself and to a specific project. Donor audits are driven by the donor itself. They're driven in terms of your grant agreement, where the donor might set out what is it that they want you to cover. Some donors are very, very specific in terms of the procedures that they expect to be done. So obviously, from an organization's perspective, to make sure that you are fully prepared, the first step is obviously just to have an understanding of what are the requirements. So if you're looking at a donor audit, you have to read through that grant agreement and understand what is it that the donor is actually looking for, having discussions with the donor to fully understand their requirements, and then obviously conveying all of that information through to the auditor that you've selected. I know with some donors, especially international donors, they're actually quite involved in the selection of the auditor itself. So make sure you understand all of these things if you have a donor audit. From a statutory audit perspective, obviously, for you to be prepared, you need to have adequate financial records, which means that your accounting records need to be captured. You need to have all of your supporting documents available. And supporting documents is quite broad. It covers things, for example, like your bank statements, your invoices, your grant agreements, your employment contracts. So there's quite a bit, depending on obviously what your organization does and what is applicable to you. The next thing is obviously important for you to be prepared is to have that continuous engagement with the auditor itself to understand what is it that the auditor requires. Different auditors have different requests or different requirements that they have that they will need for their audit files. So you have to have that initial meeting with your auditor to understand, okay, what is it that you require, what information, in what format is the information required, and then you need to communicate all of that to the relevant people within your organization. So it obviously would be finance people. So the people within the finance department need to be fully aware of what is it that the auditor requires for both statutory and donor audit purposes. Secondly, is also the non-finance people, for example, payroll or HR. So if your organization has a separate HR division, it's making sure that the staff within the HR department fully understand what is required by the auditors and when the information is required by. I can't tell you how many times I've been on an audit and we delayed because we can't get employment contracts or we cannot get timesheets or pay slips, right? Which is a basic requirement when you're doing payroll testing in an audit. And that then has a knock-on effect on the audit itself, which will then lead to delays, which could then also lead to overruns that the auditor is wanting to charge you. So obviously, in order for you to be prepared, just to sum up, it would be obviously one, understanding what is required of you, of your staff, and from both the auditor's perspective and the donor's perspective, irrespective of what audit you have, and then making sure you have everything required before you actually engage the auditor to come out. And then I think one more thing which I didn't touch on is obviously dealing with an auditor that understands the nonprofit organizations, understands what are the requirements and the compliance. And if it's a donor audit, ensuring that your donor has accepted the auditor that you've selected. So for nonprofits that are operating and performing their activities, there's quite a bit of compliance requirements that you have to be aware of. Compliance from a South African perspective, from a regulatory perspective, but also from a donor perspective. So obviously from an NPO perspective, you need to first ensure that you are fully aware of what are the different compliance requirements that you may have, both regulatory or from a donor perspective. I'm obviously not going to touch into all of the different compliance requirements because it's endless. There's quite a bit that affects nonprofits. But how should an NPO itself focus on ensuring that they are compliant? So some of the things that we would recommend to organizations is making sure you actually fully first understand what your requirements are. Have some sort of a tracking tool. So we use a tool called Asana, which is an online project management tool. So to monitor deadlines. So the worst thing you can have is being aware of something, but then you fail to comply with it because you've forgotten about the deadline and it's come and it's gone. And now the organization is being subjected to interest and penalties, for example, with SARS. So I think for you to ensure that you're compliant, one is understand. Two is put in a process in your organization which will allow you to monitor your deadlines and to track obviously compliance with it. The other thing is having the information readily available. Obviously, if you have a reporting requirement, whether it's a regulatory requirement with SARS, Department of Social Development, CIPC, right? Or you have a donor requirement. If you don't have the data available, you're not going to be able to comply with those deadlines. So it also then comes back to ensuring that your accounting processes are streamlined, they're effective, you are processing on a regular basis. You're not just leaving things for 2 months, 6 months, and then you decide to capture because there are certain deadlines or certain compliance requirements that are monthly. So obviously making sure that you understand everything and then you put in a process which will allow you to extract the data that you need timeously, and which will then allow you to submit that data in the format that is required by the various organizations that you need to report to and within the time frame. So the last part I wanted to talk about is how can an organization now manage all of these things? So we've spoken about, obviously, you need to be aware of your compliance requirements, your donor requirements, what the auditors are looking for. But how do you actually manage this on a day-to-day basis? So from an NPO perspective or from any company perspective, whether you are a nonprofit or whether you are a profit-making entity, you have to be using the tools that are available to you. So for example, if we're looking from an NPO perspective, where we need to submit maybe donor reports, right? So I've spoken about how you need to understand what the donor is looking for, and then you need to set up your accounting system in a manner which will allow you to extract that information in a meaningful format. Obviously, most donors, they have different requirements. So you're not going to have like, a one accounting system that will fit to every single donor requirements. However, what you are looking for is the setup of your system, which will allow you to extract what information you need for a specific donor itself. For example, if we talk about some of the tools that are available, so most accounting systems, or not most, but some of them do have things such as project or program reporting. In Xero, which is the software that we recommend that nonprofits use, it's called a tracking category. And what that means is that as an NPO, when you're setting up your accounting system, you can set up based on your different donors or your different projects so that every income or expense item that you have will get allocated to a specific donor or specific project. What that means then is that if you now need to pull a report, you can extract the data. Maybe you might have to do some manual intervention because the donor may have a specific format that they want information in. But the crux of it is the data, the income, the expenditure that you've spent for that period, for that specific project. That's what you will be able to extract from your system. So obviously, that's the first part, is setting up your accounting system in a manner that will allow you to pull out this information and then using software that will assist you with that. So like I said earlier, there are some softwares that have these features. Not all of them do. Some are on a paid feature. So you got to look at, okay, are you using the correct accounting system to allow you to do these things? Secondly is obviously the tools, again, coming back to understanding what is required, both internally and externally. So when I talk about internally, I'm talking about what do your board of directors want, or what is it that they want to review at their board meetings. Externally, we're talking about your donors, we're talking about your auditors, and then maybe any other um, stakeholders that might want to view your organization's information. So obviously understanding what their requirements are and then taking that information and making sure your accounting system is set up in a way that will allow you to extract that meaningful data. The third thing, obviously, from a tools perspective, right? So I've spoken about how accounting records need to be timely. I think we're all living in a digital age, so you need to make sure that you are now using a software or an accounting system that allows you to process timely. For example, previously, people would wait for bank statements to come from the bank in order to capture their transactions, which is a lot. You're then only doing your processing on a monthly basis because your bank statements literally only come at the end of the month or at the beginning of the new month. So your accounting records was always behind. But now with everything being digital and online, you can actually use a tool. For example, Xero has something called Pay and Peats, which works on a daily basis. So it's pulling your information on a daily basis. So which means that you can now be processing on a weekly basis or even on a daily basis if you want. So you can extract that information more regularly, right? As opposed to, right, I need to wait till the end of the month in order to pull the data to send to my donor, or and also allows you to track and to monitor it. So from an organization's perspective, if you now have your system set up where your income and expenses is being allocated on a maybe daily or a weekly basis, but you're also using a tool which allows you to maybe track against your budget. So I think I spoke about this in our last recording, where Xero allows you to input budgets into your accounting system. You could input a donor budget, you could input a budget for the organization itself, and then you can now track on a timely basis how are you performing against that budget. So I think obviously all of these tools is very critical to the success of an organization. And obviously you need to be aware of what tools are out there. If you are listening to this and you're still not too sure about Xero and the softwares that we are promoting or recommending that organizations utilize, contact us. You can get onto our website and then maybe just set up a consult with myself or with Riza Amra. And then we can then show you, or we could demo, how can Xero assist your organization in ensuring that you are compliant, that your accounting records are transparent, timely, and then ultimately assisting you with complying with donor requirements as well as the auditor's requirements.